There is a very specific kind of silence that takes over a room when someone says something that cannot be unsaid. Not a peaceful silence. Not the kind that follows a beautiful piece of music. The kind that follows a grenade. The kind where you watch people slowly look around at each other, calculating, recalibrating, trying to decide what they actually believed before the explosion, and what they are allowed to believe now. That is exactly the silence that dropped across hip-hop culture the moment Jay-Z stepped to a microphone at the Roots picnic and started freestyling. Not from a script, not from a pre-written verse, but off the dome, live, in front of thousands of people, and the entire internet froze. Not because it was shocking that Jay-Z could rap. It was shocking because of who it reminded us that Jay-Z is. And what it reminded Drake's most loyal supporters about the world they are currently living in. Because in that single freestyle, years of constructed narrative began to unravel in real time. And what we have been watching ever since is not just fans reacting. What we have been watching is a slow-motion psychological collapse disguised as internet commentary. If you have been anywhere near hip-hop social media this week, you already know the energy is different. Something shifted. Some conversations that were being held in hushed, careful tones suddenly became loud. And some people who had been speaking with absolute certainty started to stumble over their own words. The Drake community, and let's be real, there is a very specific ecosystem of media personalities, content creators, and superfans that operates as a unified body when it comes to protecting that brand, entered a state of disarray that has genuinely been something to behold. And I want to be clear, this is not an attack on anyone for being a fan. Being a fan is beautiful. Loyalty is beautiful. But there is a version of fandom that stops functioning as love and starts functioning as damage control. And that is the version we have been watching spiral in real time. Before we get deeper into all of this, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now if you're new here. This channel breaks down these moments with honesty and no filter, and if that's what you're here for, you're in the right place. Now let's go. Let us start with the most revealing reaction of them all, because this one tells you everything you need to know about how people calibrate their loyalty when pressure is applied. There is a well-known personality in hip-hop commentary circles, a man who has been publicly and loudly presenting himself as a lifelong Jay-Z supporter. He sat in front of a camera and announced, with a straight face, that he was cooling off on HOV. One freestyle. One impromptu performance that wasn't even a diss track. It was a freestyle at someone else's event. And this person decided that was the moment to publicly distance himself from Jay-Z. Now, ask yourself, what is the logical chain of events that leads someone there? Because that is not the reaction of a fan. That is not even the reaction of a casual observer. That is the reaction of someone who understood on a very deep level what that freestyle represented for the man they actually support, and decided preemptively that they needed to take the exit ramp before the highway ended. He even tried to wrap it in the language of critical analysis. He talked about Jay's content choices, his approach, his direction as an artist, as if those were the real concerns that had been quietly bothering him all this time, and it just happened to surface the week Jay-Z clapped back at Drake. The transparency of it was almost poetic. Almost. Because what it really showed was something we have known for a long time about this particular brand of Drake support. Facts are not actually a deal breaker for the argument. Perception is. Narrative is.
Momentum is.
And the moment the momentum shifted, so did the alignment. That is not fandom. That is something else entirely. And then there is Maul. Let's talk about Maul because this one genuinely made me pause. For people who don't know the history here, this is not someone who just discovered hip-hop last Tuesday. This is someone with a documented, publicly visible, long-standing relationship with Jay-Z's world. And yet here he is on camera, stating clearly that if Drake and Jay-Z were to go to battle, he is riding with Drake. Not subtly, not reluctantly, loudly, with conviction. Now, you can say a lot of things about loyalty and how people choose their alliances. But there is something almost philosophically interesting about a man declaring that he would abandon a decade-plus relationship with one of the most respected figures in hip-hop history to stand beside someone who has spent the last 2 years watching his own legacy take serious damage in real time. What is driving that decision? What is the calculation? Because from the outside looking in, it does not look like a strategic move. It does not look like a principled stance. It looks like someone who has made a significant investment, emotionally, professionally, reputationally, into a particular outcome, and is now so far down that road that they cannot afford to turn around. That is the thing about these situations. People get too deep. And once you are too deep, every new piece of evidence gets filtered through the lens of the investment you have already made. You stop evaluating facts. You start defending decisions. And there is a version of this that almost generates sympathy because we all know people who have made choices they could not walk back. But sympathy does not equal respect. And Maul, whether he knows it or not, has put himself in a position where the best you could say about him is that with friends like this, no one actually needs enemies. He is essentially delivering an endorsement for a camp that he should have no loyalty to at the expense of an alliance that actually predates most of the people in this current conversation. And people were also noting that Maul himself said barely a few weeks ago that he was a devoted HOV supporter, someone deeply embedded in that world. To flip that completely, not after a bad album or a personal falling out, but after a single freestyle at a festival that Drake did not even attend, that is not a measured position change. That is a panic move. That is someone seeing which way the wind blew and trying to get ahead of the forecast. And the irony of all ironies is that this kind of behavior, this rapid, visible, self-serving pivot, is exactly what he would criticize in someone else. If you think he is doing this out of pure love for Drake's artistry, I have a bridge to sell you. Now, let's get into the academic commentary side of this, because this is where things get truly fascinating from a media analysis standpoint. There is a well-known hip-hop commentator who has built an entire identity around being a voice of authority on rap culture, and he went on camera to make the argument that Jay-Z would actually be a better matchup for Drake than Kendrick Lamar was. His reasoning was that Kendrick's skill set is uniquely formidable, dynamic, capable of switching sounds, versatile in a way that makes him nearly impossible to match in a traditional battle framework. And look, on a purely technical level, that argument has some surface logic to it. Kendrick Lamar is genuinely one of the most complete rappers to ever touch a microphone. But here is where the argument collapsed under its own weight. This same commentator was then prepared to suggest that Drake would actually have a real shot at defeating Jay-Z. And that is where I had to put the video down for a second and collect myself. Because if your argument for why Drake loses to Kendrick is that Kendrick is too skilled and too complete and too dynamic, and your argument for why Drake beats Jay-Z is that Jay is less relevant or more vulnerable to a mudslinging approach, what you are actually telling me is that you think Drake can only win a battle on a level that has nothing to do with rapping. You are inadvertently admitting that in a pure hip-hop context, Drake loses. And you're hoping to find a battleground outside of hip-hop where the rules are different. That is an extraordinary thing to concede, while trying to make the argument that your guy is good. But he went even further than that. He went on to claim that the entire confrontation between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, the one that defined 2024, the one that produced some of the most talked about moments in rap battle history in recent memory, was actually orchestrated. That Kendrick and the others were never really the main event. That it was always supposed to be Drake versus Jay-Z, and that Kendrick was a pawn in that larger game. Now, I want to sit with that claim for a moment, because I think it is genuinely one of the most unintentionally revealing things that has been said during this entire saga. If Kendrick Lamar was a pawn, and I want you to truly think about this, then what does it say about Drake that the pawn took him off the board? Because in chess, a pawn does not typically eliminate the queen. When a pawn eliminates the queen, you do not get to retroactively rewrite the pawn as just a pawn anymore. The pawn becomes something else. The pawn becomes a piece that changed the entire shape of the game. So either Kendrick was not a pawn, or Drake is the one whose value got reassessed when the pawn made contact. Either way, that argument does not land where it is intended to land. But this is the intellectual gymnastics we are watching in real time. The mental leaps, the tortured analogies, the constant reframing. Not in service of truth, but in service of keeping a narrative alive that the actual events of the last 2 years have consistently refused to support. And before we go further, if you are finding this breakdown valuable, if you appreciate that we are actually analyzing the logic and not just posting takes, hit that like button and subscribe. This kind of content takes real work to put together, and your support makes it possible. Now, let's keep building because we are barely at the surface of how deep this goes. The Dame Dash commentary deserves its own chapter because nothing captures the nature of biased analysis quite like watching someone try to perform objectivity while their entire emotional architecture screams the opposite. Dame sat in front of a camera and delivered what was framed as a balanced critique of Jay-Z's appearance at the Roots picnic. He talked about Jay's hairstyle. He talked about his clothing choices. He expressed that he felt embarrassed watching it. And he implied, with the language of concern rather than malice, that Jay should not have been out there doing this, that at this point in his life, it should be beneath him. Now set aside for a moment that Jay-Z has sold out Yankee Stadium multiple times. Set aside that the man commands arenas around the world on the strength of his catalog alone, without the aid of the elaborate production mechanisms that many contemporary artists depend on to fill those seats. Set aside all of that, and just sit with the core of what Dame is actually saying. He is saying that a man who clearly loves what he does, who has the skill and the stamina to continue doing it at a high level, should stop. Because of what? Because of the optics? Because of a hairstyle? Because of what the moment looked like to someone who has spent years nursing a bitterness about a chapter of his life that ended not entirely on his own terms? Because that is what is underneath every word of that critique. The bitterness of someone who feels left out of a story he helped begin. And there is something deeply human about that. Something almost sympathetic. But it does not make the argument valid. Morgan Freeman still takes roles because he loves to act. The greatest musicians in history have created into their 70s and 80s. You do not put an expiration date on passion. You simply do not. And the people in that crowd at the Roots picnic did not come because of Jay-Z's haircut. They came because when that music started, something happened inside them that only music at its best can do. That nostalgia hit. That feeling of recognition. That sense that this is real and has always been real. No hairstyle takes that away. But it is telling that the only rebuttal available was the one about his appearance. Because when the actual substance is too strong to attack, you go after the presentation. Always. And this brings us to a theme that has been running through all of these reactions, threaded through every argument, every commentary clip, every fan post. And that theme is fear. Not the kind of fear that announces itself. The kind that disguises itself as criticism. The kind that says he is not relevant enough to respond to, while spending 72 straight hours talking about him. The kind that says this battle is not worth having, while desperately constructing arguments for why the battle would go a certain way. Fear is loud when it is trying to be quiet. And what we are seeing from the most vocal corners of Drake's support network is a group of people who went through 2 years of something genuinely difficult, because whether you love Drake or not, losing a rap battle at that scale, in that way, with that much cultural weight attached to the outcome, is not nothing, and now they are being asked to face the possibility of doing it again, but this time with someone whose credentials in this space are arguably even more established. Because, let us be honest about who Jay-Z is in the context of this conversation. This is not an emerging challenger. This is not someone whose best work is debated. This is one of the architects. One of the people who defined what it means to make rap music that is simultaneously commercially dominant and culturally significant. And the idea of Drake stepping into a battle with someone of that stature after the last 2 years, with whatever capital he has left, and coming out looking good, that is a very difficult scenario to construct. Not impossible. Nothing is impossible in hip-hop, which is part of what makes it great. But difficult. And difficult is something that Drake's most loyal supporters are not emotionally prepared to confront right now. There is also something worth dissecting in the specific language being used around this moment. The phrase Jay-Z is easier than Kendrick keeps circulating as if it is a casual observation rather than an extraordinary statement. Easy is a word that only makes sense in a context where Drake is the measuring stick. Easy compared to whom? Easy in what arena? Because Jay-Z has been in creative battles his entire career. His whole narrative is built on surviving challenges, outlasting critics, and continuing to produce work that commands respect. The idea that someone who has been in the booth since the early 1990s, who has navigated every era of hip-hop without losing his standing, who has just proven impromptu at someone else's event with no promotional run-up, that he can still command a room and a conversation. The idea that he is easy for Drake right now is either deeply wishful or deeply delusional. And I want to be careful here because I am not trying to say that Drake has no skills. Drake is a genuinely talented individual who has built a real and significant career. But the way some of these conversations are being framed, it sounds like people are discussing a battle between a reigning champion and a ranked challenger, when what has actually happened over the last 2 years is that the ranking got reassessed significantly. The conversation changed. And if you cannot see that, you are either deliberately avoiding it or you are too deep in the loyalty loop to access objectivity. What makes this whole situation even more cinematic is the irony of the origin story. Because Drake was not standing still when all of this happened. He was not minding his business, creating art in peace, and suddenly found himself under attack from all directions. He was the one throwing. He was the one who sent shots at multiple people on a project that was meant to be a statement, a declaration of where he stood culturally and artistically. And one of those shots landed on Jay-Z. And Jay-Z, who did not need to respond, who had absolutely nothing to gain in the traditional sense from engaging, who could have simply let the moment pass, chose to respond. And chose to respond in a way that felt effortless. And that effortlessness is the most damaging part of it. Because there is nothing more disorienting in a confrontation than watching the person you challenged respond with ease. It communicates something about the baseline differential that no amount of statistical framing can undo. The streams, the chart positions, the numbers, none of that speaks to what happened in those few minutes at the Roots picnic. What happened there was a man demonstrating that he still has it. And more importantly, that the idea of engaging with Drake on this level does not require him to change anything fundamental about himself or his approach. That is the message in the response. Not, I am threatened. Not, I need to prove something. The message is, this is where I live, and you are visiting. And now the fan bases are doing what fan bases do in the aftermath of moments like this. They are negotiating. They are processing. They are finding the frames that let them preserve what they believed before the event. So, you have people saying the freestyle was not that impressive. You have people saying Jay's delivery was off. You have people counting syllables and analyzing flow as if this were a technical exercise and not a cultural moment. You have people invoking the hair again, and I want to linger on this for a second because it is one of the most telling things about the state of the counterargument. When the most consistent, most amplified talking point against a freestyle is the appearance of the person who delivered it, you have already lost the argument. Not partially, completely, because you are standing in front of a piece of music and talking about hair. And look, I understand why the hair became the focal point for some people. When you cannot attack the content, when the words themselves are strong enough that direct refutation becomes difficult, you look for something else. You find the peripheral detail, the choice of clothes, the venue, the way a person stands at a microphone, anything that lets you redirect the conversation away from what was actually said and towards something manageable, something trivial, something that can be discussed without having to engage with the substance. It is the oldest deflection in the book, and audiences are smart enough to see it when it happens. The people watching these reactions, the ones in the comment sections and on social media who are supposedly being persuaded by these arguments, many of them know exactly what is happening. They can feel the deflection. They can sense when someone is working very hard to say a lot of words while avoiding the one thing that actually needs to be addressed. And that feeling, that quiet recognition, is doing real damage to the credibility of the voices who are supposed to be the authorities in this conversation. When you have lost the argument, and you know you have lost the argument, the only play left is spectacle. And spectacle runs out of gas faster than substance does. Always. Let me also address the revisionism happening around the original battle because it is directly connected to all of this. There are people actively trying to reconstruct what happened in 2024, not just what the songs said, but what it meant. They're trying to argue that Drake made better music, that the outcome was not what it appeared to be. That public perception was manipulated. And look, you are allowed to love Drake's music. You are allowed to prefer his sound, his approach, his aesthetic. That is legitimate. Taste is real. But the claim that the cultural verdict on that battle was manufactured, that the overwhelming consensus of listeners, critics, and the broader hip-hop community was somehow engineered rather than earned, that is a claim that requires you to believe an extraordinary conspiracy. It requires you to believe that millions of independent people, with different tastes and different loyalties and different histories with hip-hop, all arrived at the same conclusion through manipulation rather than through their own genuine reaction to the music. And I think most reasonable people, when they sit with that honestly, can feel how thin that argument is. The songs landed the way they landed because they were what they were. That is it. That is the whole story. And the attempt to rewrite it now is not born from new evidence. It is born from the discomfort of watching the original verdict get reinforced by a new moment. Now I want to talk about what the battle would actually mean if it happens, because I think this is where things get most interesting. There is a version of this where Drake says nothing, where he recognizes that engaging with Jay-Z right now at this specific moment, with the cultural momentum where it currently sits, would not serve him. And there is logic to that. There is a real argument for silence as strategy. But here is the tension in that argument. Drake already spoke. The album already existed. The shots were already thrown. You do not get to release a whole project aimed at multiple targets, get a response, and then claim that the response was unworthy of engagement. Because you already engaged. Your engagement was the album. So the silence now is not silence as a power move. It is silence as an acknowledgement that you did not expect the response to come the way it came. And the fans who are arguing that Drake should not respond, that Jay-Z is not worth the energy, those same fans were celebrating every single bar on that album when it came out. They were not applying the not worth it framework then. They only discovered that framework when the shots came back. That is not strategy. That is damage control, wearing a strategy costume. And I want to come back to something that I think cuts through all of the noise more cleanly than anything else in this conversation. Push T had Drake on the ropes. That is not a controversial statement. That is something that even people who are not deeply invested in this particular debate can look back at and acknowledge. The battle with Push T ended in a way that did not feel like a clean win for Drake. And if Push T, who is an incredible rapper but who occupies a different tier in terms of mainstream recognition and resources than Jay-Z, if Push T could create that kind of damage, what does the logic say about Jay-Z? What does it say about someone who is arguably in a different category entirely in terms of skill, catalog, cultural authority, and the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from 3 decades of operating at the highest level? You cannot point to the Push T situation as evidence that Drake is vulnerable and then turn around and argue that Jay-Z is somehow less of a threat. The math does not add up. And I think somewhere underneath all the noise, the most honest voices, even within the Drake support ecosystem, know this. Which is why the conversation keeps getting more frantic. Which is why the talking points keep getting louder instead of sharper. The volume is an indicator of the anxiety. And the anxiety is real. Here is something I want you to genuinely think about, because this goes beyond the battle, beyond the freestyle, beyond any single moment in this saga. There is a pattern in how Drake's public persona has operated over the last several years, and that pattern has been visible enough that even some of the people who have been most loudly supportive of him have started to see the outline of it. The pattern is this: escalate, then reframe yourself as the victim. It happened in 2024. It is happening again now. The shots go out, the responses come in, and suddenly the framing shifts from Drake is going at everyone to Drake is being ganged up on. The industry is against him. The media is biased. The other rappers are coordinating. There is always an external force being blamed for the outcome. And I understand why that narrative exists. It is emotionally useful. It is protective. It creates a community of people who feel like they are defending something against unfair attack. But here's the problem with that framework over time. It requires you to continuously expand the conspiracy. Every new response becomes part of the plot. Every new voice becomes a pawn. Every new moment of accountability becomes evidence of coordination. And eventually, if you follow that logic far enough, you end up in a place where the only person who ever did anything wrong is everyone else. And that is not a story that holds up under scrutiny. It is a story that holds up in an echo chamber. But echo chambers are temporary. They end the moment someone steps up to a microphone at a picnic in Philadelphia and starts flowing without a script. What is also worth noting here, and this is something that got glossed over in a lot of the reaction commentary, is the specific character of the Jay-Z freestyle response. It was not a full-length diss track. It was not a pre-planned, meticulously produced release with a midnight drop and a rollout and a cover image. It was an improvised moment at someone else's event. And that is arguably its most powerful characteristic. Because what it communicated was not, I took this seriously enough to make a whole song. What it communicated was, I took this seriously enough to address it right now on the spot, without preparation, and still left you with something to talk about for days. That is a level of confidence that cannot be manufactured. You cannot fake that kind of composure. And the fact that it hijacked the entire hip-hop conversation, that it pushed every other topic off the front page, including the album that was supposed to be the main event, tells you everything about the specific gravity that some voices carry in this culture. Some people's whispers are louder than other people's shouts. And that hierarchy did not end just because the streaming numbers shifted for a few years. Cultural authority is not a subscription you cancel. It is something you earn over decades, and it does not expire just because someone else got more chart placements for a while. So, where does all of this leave us? What is the actual story being told by all of these reactions, all of these spiraling takes, all of this frantic commentary? I think the story is this. There is a community of people who built a belief system around a version of hip-hop history that put a specific person at the center of everything. And for a while, that version of history seemed defensible. The numbers were there. The hits were there. The cultural presence was overwhelming. But belief systems built on momentum are uniquely vulnerable to the moment the momentum shifts. Because then you are not just reevaluating the current moment. You are potentially reevaluating everything. Every claim, every ranking, every argument that was built on the assumption that the momentum would continue indefinitely. And that reevaluation is terrifying for the people who made it their identity, which is why they are fighting so hard not to do it, which is why the takes are getting wilder, which is why the defenses are getting more elaborate, which is why a man who has known Jay-Z for decades is publicly declaring his loyalty to Drake. They are not reacting to a freestyle. They are reacting to what the freestyle means. And what it means is that the story is not over. And the ending they had already written in their heads might not be the one that actually gets told. As for Drake himself, and I say this with full acknowledgement that I cannot know what is going through his mind, the position he is in right now is one of the most genuinely difficult positions in entertainment. Not because he lacks resources. Not because he lacks talent. But because he is caught between two options that both carry significant risk. If he responds to Jay-Z, he is stepping back into a war with someone who just demonstrated, for free, at someone else's event, that the fire is still there. If he stays silent, the silence itself becomes the story. It becomes evidence. It becomes the thing that people point to when they describe this chapter of his career. There is no comfortable position. There is no choice that does not carry weight. And the people around him who are saying, just let it go, just stick to the pop lane, just drop a banger and get back on the charts, they may not be wrong about the practicality of that advice. But practicality and legacy are two different conversations. And Drake has spent his entire career trying to be in the legacy conversation. You cannot opt out of the legacy conversation when it gets uncomfortable and then expect to be taken seriously when you try to opt back in when things feel safer. That is the real question underneath all of this noise. What is the legacy of this moment going to look like? Not next week. Not in 6 months. But 10 years from now, when people are telling the story of this era of hip-hop. What will they say about this specific chapter? And I think the answer to that question is being written right now, in real time, through every response and non-response and spiraling take. History is being made in the commentary section. History is being made in the podcasts and the reaction videos and the tweets at midnight from people who cannot sleep because they are still processing what they heard at the Roots picnic. And the people who are making those comments and those videos and those tweets do not always realize that they are part of the story. They think they are observing, but they are participating. They are adding something to the record. And the record, as always, will be used to judge this moment for a long time after the moment is over. Hip-hop has always been a culture that rewards truth-telling over image management. It has always been a space where the most durable legacies belong to the people who showed up as themselves and let the work speak for what they actually were. The people who manufactured personas without the substance to back them up eventually got found out. Not always immediately. Sometimes it took years. But eventually, the music told the truth. And right now, the music is telling a very specific truth about where things stand. A freestyle happened. The internet stopped. The conversation shifted. And no amount of commentary, no matter how loud or how dedicated, is going to change the fact that it happened. You cannot unring a bell.
You can argue about what the bell sounded like.
You can argue about whether it was rung at the right time or in the right place. But the sound is in the air. And everyone heard it. And the people who are working the hardest to convince you that you did not hear what you heard are the same people who heard it clearest of all. If you have been with me through this entire breakdown, I genuinely appreciate you. This is the kind of content that takes real investment to make, not just time, but actual thought. And the fact that you are here for it means everything. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that button right now because this channel is only going to keep getting sharper and more in-depth as this whole situation continues to unfold. And trust me, it is far from over. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Drake responds? Do you think Jay-Z takes this further? Do you think any of the people we talked about today are going to walk back what they said? I want to hear your honest reactions. The conversation down there is always worth having. And I will be reading every single one. Because here's the thing that I keep coming back to at the end of all of this. The people who are saying Jay-Z does not matter. The people who are saying this is not worth responding to. The people who are saying the freestyle was nothing special and Drake should not dignify it with a reply. Those people have been talking about absolutely nothing else for 3 consecutive days. They have produced more content, more posts, more commentary, more reaction videos, more spiraling hot takes about something that supposedly does not matter than about anything that actually has a release date and a marketing push behind it. If it truly did not matter, the silence would be easy. But the silence is not there. The noise is deafening. And noise, in this case, is the most honest indicator of what everyone actually already knows. The king came outside. The building shook. And the question that none of them want to answer out loud is the one that is going to define the next chapter of the story. What happens now?